CSX upfront agreed to reimburse the city for all expenses incurred. An invoice has been generated and sent. So through communications back and forth during the days leading up to the cleanup of the property, there was communication back and forth between our law office and CSX, and in that communication, they agreed that they would reimburse for the cleanup expenses. Now, I'll walk you up to how we got there, because you're right, Counselor. There have been a group of homeless people living on the CSX property for decades. There's no question about that. When I did outside code enforcement, I was out there a few times. And at the end of the day, you're right. CSX is a private property owner, and they are responsible. And I'll get to the point in the process where the city did issue a notice to abate a nuisance to CSX, and that was what really brought them to the table, I believe, and got their cooperation in finally accepting some responsibility for that property. Because I'll tell you, my 2 years of doing outside code enforcement, I chased them the whole 2 years and never got a whole lot out of them. They're based out of Jacksonville, Florida. The bureaucracy is bigger than the federal government, it seems like. They were a very difficult entity to deal with, and until we sent a very strong message, then all of a sudden we could get the right people on the phone, the right people on email, and get some responses. But let me start answering your questions. I'll try to do them in chronological order. Yeah, there's been a homeless population out in that CSX rail yards for decades. Over the last couple of years, during my time as mayor, we've seen significant changes in the nature of that encampment, in the amount of people in that encampment, and the illegal activity going on that property. There's no question in my mind, and now this is going to be my personal opinion, that the opiate addiction crisis has a lot to do with it. If there is one overwhelming common denominator amongst the majority of the people that have been staying out there, it's heroin addiction. And that's new in the last couple of years. That wasn't the case 5 or 10 years ago. And when I have lengthy conversations with our first responders who are out there all the time, and I think to those concerns you listed, Counselor, we have to add the safety of our own police, fire, and EMS personnel that we were repeatedly sending out there responding to calls. And in my opinion, in the police chief's opinion, and the fire chief's opinion, had reached the point where our own personnel were at risk every time they had to respond to a call out there. And that was a key factor in my decision to finally take action. But over the last couple of years, the population out there has grown substantially. They have encroached more on the borders of the property. They were having a much greater impact on property owners and residents and businesses that immediately surround that area. The police department and I have been out for a couple of meetings with the condo owners on Crescent Street across from the BAT station who are pleading for help because they're finding needles in their parking lot, encountering people in the middle of the night. We heard from a nurse who was nervous to walk to her car at 5 o'clock in the morning by herself because she was running into people that were using their parking area to use drugs or do other activities that are spilling out over from inside the CSX property. Banner Systems, a company that's been there for decades and has lived with the situation bordering their property for decades, was at the breaking point, sent us some very pointed correspondence that led to the police chief, the fire chief, myself, and a couple of others going out and meeting with him at his business to hear about the impacts it was having on him and how he was for the first time considering leaving Brockton because he could not tolerate the negative impacts he was getting on a daily basis, including his employees and family members being assaulted in his own parking lot by people that were living in the woods out behind his property. So there's that aspect of the growing population. Then there's the aspect, and I confirmed a lot of this with longtime homeless advocates. For years, it was a place where some chronically homeless people stayed, and we all acknowledge that. What it had become now was not just a place where homeless people stayed, but where people were coming and going at all hours of the days and the night for the purposes of conducting illegal activity out on that property outside the eye of the city. We had constant reports of we're responding to overdoses out there, assaults and batteries, rapes, drug dealing. It was really had become the wild, wild west out there. And I would encourage you to speak to some of the families that I spoke to on Mulberry Street and Elliott Street that described prostitutes coming off that property and performing sex acts in cars parked in front of their houses with their kids there, with people parking their cars to go on and off that property to buy and sell drugs. It was really had reached a breaking point with the surrounding neighborhoods. And then pull that together with the string of fires that were occurring, that were arson, that I'll let Chief Williams address. But the breaking point for me, and I won't put words in his mouth, I'll let Chief Williams address it, was after a string of several fires, one of which one of these people tried to burn down Banner Systems, tried to set his building on fire. But after a string of arson fires, they were out there on, I don't remember the date, but I remember it very clearly. They're out there on a Friday night for the second time. There had been a significant fire about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I got a text at 11 o'clock that night from Chief Williams, who was out on that property himself with his firefighters, expressing to me in a text that we needed to do something, that not only were the people living on that property at imminent risk, but also he felt as though his firefighters were being placed in harm's way by being asked to repeatedly respond to fires under adverse conditions out there, no easy access to water, heavy underbrush, people all over the place, dirty needles everywhere, latrines full of open sewerage everywhere, and propane tanks, of which on that one night they seized about 20 propane tanks that were in the immediate vicinity of that fire. I didn't sleep well that Friday night, and on Saturday morning I began a series of conversations with the police chief, the fire chief, and a few of our other department heads that led to me calling an emergency meeting that Monday morning, in which we brought all of the department heads and law enforcement people in. We also invited in our social service people from the city, Corin Capiello from my office, Lieutenant Linehan from the police department, who does a lot of work in that population, and we even had Father Bills at the table. And on this particular operation, even Father Bills joined us in supporting what we did, because they knew chronic homeless people who wouldn't stay out there anymore because they were concerned for their own safety. So it really just reached a critical point, Counselor, where both public health, because of the open human feces, I won't get into graphic detail, but trust me, we'll send you some photos if you'd like to see them. Just really horrible. Hundreds of dirty needles, just the living conditions, the illegal activity, and the immediate threat to public safety, both to the people there and to our first responders, I think put us in a position where we had to act. But I think that what Lieutenant Linehan will describe to you and what Chief Williams will describe to you was a very measured, compassionate approach. We took 1 week leading up to the day that we actually went to clean the property, where we had social workers trying to connect people with services out there. We had homeless advocates that knew some of the people out there. We had advocates from the Champion Plan, from Lieutenant Linehan, Community Policing. We worked as best we could with the folks who were actually staying out there overnight to help people relocate or connect with services before we came in to clean up the property. But there's no question in my mind that because of the health and safety of the people there, the health and safety of our first responders, the fact that it had become a mecca for illegal activity, the dramatic negative impact it was having on both residents and businesses in the surrounding area, that we were compelled to act, we were authorized to act, we issued an order to abate a nuisance. That led to CSX coming to the table voluntarily and working with us, and us insisting that CSX start taking some responsibility for their property. So That's my overview, but I think that Lieutenant Linehan and Chief Williams and Chief Crowley and others can shed light on some of your specific questions. But I do
had one
know
question,
the
Mr. Thank you for that
DPW did
summary.
issue an invoice for the total cost of the cleanup.